Good morning. It is a privilege to be here with you today. I'll ask everyone to take their seats. My name is Dr. Andy Schumann. I am a bioethicist at the University of Michigan, and I'm privileged to run the Clinical Ethics Service at the University of Michigan. I'm also privileged to chair the program committee for this year's ASBH meeting and to formally welcome you here to this meeting. Already, this has been an incredible opportunity for folks to network, learn, share, discuss, and I look forward to another day and a half of doing so with all of you. I hope you've been enjoying the program and our reflection on the past 25 years of ASBH, looking forward to the future 25 years of ASBH. The sessions has been variable, interesting, dynamic, everything from history to painting to everything in between. I look forward to connecting with you all at the new and old members meeting. You don't need to self-identify as new or old. And join us for that meeting this afternoon, as well as for the new member and first-time attendee reception that we will be hosting this evening. We also will be introducing today's plenary, which is a real treat and one that I'm particularly excited about. Policymakers' unmet desire for ethicists. How can we work with policymakers to make the substantial differences that we've talked about from the opening plenary throughout the meeting? This session is also generally supported by the Institute of Bioethics and Health Humanities at UTMB, and we thank them for their generous support. I will introduce our panelists and go from there. First is Dr. Adam Seth Levine. Dr. Levine is the Agora Institute Associate Professor of Health Policy and Management at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University, just down the street. His research and scholarship span a number of topics in political science, public health, climate change, law, and economics, with a special focus on how citizens engage in civic and public life. Also, I introduce Ms. Elizabeth Walters, who is the chair of the Democratic Party for the state of Ohio. She serves in multiple roles to advocate for community-based causes and also is the council president of Summit County and on the advisory council for the United Way of Summit County's Financial Empowerment Centers. Finally, we will be moderated today by Dr. Kahn, the director of the Berman Institute of Bioethics and a professor at Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health. His research and public scholarship focus on research ethics, public health, emerging biomedical technologies, and he has collaborated with multiple institutions, both regionally and nationally, the National Academy of Medicine, the Hastings Center, the federal government, the CDC, and NIH. We will be focusing on a familiar topic through a new lens. What role do policymakers want ethicists to have? As we go forward, how can ethicists best engage with the policymaking process in ways that are productive and move the needle forward on the issues we are so passionate about? Thank you again for being here, and thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning. All right, well, I know where we're standing between you and lunch. We're gonna try that one more time. Good morning. Thank you. And just because I'm surrounded by people from Michigan, I'm gonna try it. OH. There we go, we're everywhere. Thank you, good morning. So my name is Liz Walters, and thank you so much for having me today. As I shared with Adam earlier, this is a bit of, just like I think I'm probably an anomaly for you, this is a bit of an anomaly for me. As you heard, I am a political actor in my state, but I also serve in county government. And while Adam will tell you a lot today about the quantitative research he's done into this space, my job is to provide you a little bit more of the qualitative experience of a local policymaker and implementer in a political environment, and how and why we need your help in making government better and serving people more effectively. So to do that, I want to share a little bit of my background of how I became an elected official and a political actor, because like many of you, like most people in this space, turns out when we're asked what we want to be when we grow up in kindergarten, very rarely does someone say, I want to be a county council member. It's not in our vocabulary as children. Like most people in this country, I came into the political space because I faced what I viewed as a moral outrage happening to me and in my community. When I was a senior in college, I'm the only child of a single parent, grew up in a multi-generational household, and when I was a senior in college, as we were caring for my grandfather at the end of his life, my mom ended up declaring bankruptcy because of unexpected medical costs. And as many of you in this room know, that is not, unfortunately, a rare occurrence in our country. And that led me to deeply question the policies and kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of, surely we've missed a piece of paperwork, or this decision was wrong, or the insurance company messed up the billing. And so, little college senior me on my computer in a study lab trying to run down all these questions led me to the discovery of Medicare policy and how decision makers in Washington, through the best of intentions, create policies that often leave big holes for people and big challenges for healthcare customers, for families, for communities, and by extension, the entire country. And while I didn't know it at the time, that set my life on a much different path that led me into a more political activist space and eventually on to serving in public office myself. Fast forward to the beginning of the pandemic, and I was working remotely on a host of political projects at home. And believe it or not, in the political action side, we care deeply about spending money, immense amounts of money that move through that space, spending it well and spending it effectively. So once again, finds me going down a rabbit hole on the internet where I find a paper written by Adam and just cold emailed him and say, hey, your research is really interesting. I'd like to talk more about some of the things you've learned in your work, which led me to learning about research for impact and how we can do more to connect political actors or public policy actors to research efforts to help inform how we spread good practices around the country in the academic and policymaking space. And that began our friendship. This is the first time we've met in person, is today. We've had a 4-year friendship on Zoom, probably like many of you have had coming out of the pandemic. And so through that course of that conversation, we just got to know a lot about each other's work. And one of the things that intrigued Adam and I in our conversations was this unique role for local government actors. And there's a reason why you're talking to me, a county actor versus a member of Congress, because as the old saying goes, right, we campaign in poetry, we govern in prose. And in the same way, federal government is poetry, county government is where the meat of the work happens, right? We get a lot of great ideas that come out of really brilliant minds in Congress and mostly smart minds in our state legislatures, some exceptions. And at the end of the day, though, they play very little role in implementing government for people. That belongs to county and city leaders. The county government is the administrative arm of the state. So every policy, every dollar that almost universally that passes through Washington or passes, in my case, through Columbus, gets spent through the county apparatus. And so I serve as the president of county council in Summit County. It is the 4th largest county and the 7th largest state in the country. I represent 546,000 residents across 31 counties, townships, and villages. We have 12 administrative departments, 46 boards and commissions. Our annual budget is $650 million. We have about 2,800 full-time employees, and that is the starting point for how we deliver everything from how people's potholes get filled to how their Medicare functions to how their SNAP and food assistance is administered. We are, if we kind of say it this way, right, if federal and state government are, if this was the movie business, I just got home from a trip to LA, they're creative and marketing, we are production and logistics, right? And we often have to make really difficult decisions that are driven predominantly by budget and the regulatory structures in which we work. We work in an executive and council model, which we also have a strong home rule, which means we have a little bit more room to work than a lot of our colleagues. In Ohio, most counties are a 3-commissioner system, and they are really bound more strictly to Ohio Revised Code than we are. And so when we have that extra space to run, we're often confronted with really hard questions, not just about what should we do, but what can we do, and then what will we do? And those last 2 questions are a function of how we can operate within the regulations we face, but then how we muster the political will to do so. And I think that as we move through that, the other thing I'll share with you too that's really important is that we are a bipartisan body. So it is Republicans and Democrats, but especially coming out of the last few years and as we come into the next couple of, probably 2 to 3 years as well, there are really important big decisions being made by local elected officials that will impact our public health systems, that will impact our criminal justice systems, that will impact a whole host of different pieces of everyday life for citizens. And I will tell you from personal experience, an ethicist has never been at the table with us in those conversations. To give you a sense of our body in county government, it's an 11-member body, and it's gonna sound like I'm telling the opening to a joke, but I'm not. It's a funeral director, a corporate lawyer, an HR professional, a psych nurse, a pediatric nurse, a homelessness nonprofit leader, an ethnic grocery store owner, a retired CPA, a retired elections official, a rental property owner, and me, who is the most clear party hack of them all, and I own that title. And you'll note, right, not an academic, not an ethicist among us. And as a body, we are responsible for spending $650 million a year. And oftentimes, the only times we get input on how to do that from someone outside the structure is if they show up and get in our face. And I mean this with love and respect to all of our voters, right? Everyone is 10 feet tall behind a keyboard, tweeting at us, writing op-eds. That's great. You're just noise at this point, right? Like, write the story, but if you don't show up in person, like, we don't really give a shit. Sorry to say it, right? Like, it just, our politics on both sides has gotten pretty shrill in the public discourse, so we learn to tune it out. And so the decisions are informed and made by the grown-ups who show up in the room ready to do the work. And I'll give you the perfect example of what has happened here in the last few years. So we are this ragtag group of public servants with a clearly mixed background. We, all of us, partisanship, our day jobs aside, truly do come to this with the best of intentions, right? I have yet to truly meet anyone who has pursued public office. There's been a few, but not many. With just the, brash, ambitious drive for power. Also, if that's what you're looking for, they are in the wrong business. Local government is not really the place for that. But starting in 2019, I don't think any of us could have imagined what was in store for us over the course of the next few years. And to lay it out for you really succinctly, there were 4 huge things that have shaped our life in the local community. 1, Summit County was the bellwether case for the opiate litigation nationally. So if you'll recall, a bunch of local governments filed class action against all the opiate production companies. We were pulled out by the federal court as the bellwether case, and we were awarded a $104 million settlement to the county as a result of that. Immediately following that, COVID-19 happened. The pandemic itself happened. Our county was awarded $105 million in the American Recovery Act, and then another $94 million from the COVID Relief Act. The infrastructure bill, which is still playing out, poises to bring over $200 million investment just to Summit County alone. And then on top of that, we had the murder of George Floyd, which called us all to the table to discuss different ways to tackle racism as a public health crisis. So we have these immense and important social discussions and cultural discussions and legal discussions happening about justice, equality, inclusion, equity, all while receiving an influx of nearly $500 million, right? And again, these decisions are being made by a funeral director, a corporate lawyer, an HR professional, right? And I will say, we know enough to know what we don't know, and are often asking to bring in folks to help us consult and make these decisions. But when you are under the pressure of a timeline for federal investment, that all that COVID money, all that American Recovery money had to be spent by a certain deadline and within a certain construct, our opiate case money comes with directives from the federal jurisdiction that was overseen. We need help in making those decisions. I will say, though, this, and I know Adam's going to talk about this a little bit, please be proactive in building the relationship. The worst time to show up and tell us you've got an opinion is after we've already passed the budget. Tweeting about us after the fact doesn't really do a lot of good, but these things come from the work of relationship. And I can speak from personal experience of, I don't think I've ever told someone who's reached out in my community wanting to share, inform, or help guide decision-making to take a hike. I've always been like, this is so great, thanks. Because often the chamber, when we make decisions, the chamber's empty. It is very unusual to have members of the public, let alone subject matter experts, proactively join the discussions in their local or city governments. We joke, like, county government at its best is invisible. You only hear about us when something's going horribly wrong or someone's embezzling millions of dollars. And so that's what we don't ever want to get to. So I will just encourage you, and I know Adam will talk a little bit more about the research amongst kind of my community writ large, but to go on the journey, right? To come into the work. Don't wait for the invitation. That's not what American government was built with, right? There is no invitation needed. The founding of this country, when it was put together, it was designed so that the funeral director, the HR director, the ethnic grocery store owner were the folks called to make the decisions for us all, because it is all of us that are involved in this work. So your voices matter, your expertise matters. We don't have the tools always to ask the hard questions of ourselves. We talk about ethics, but it doesn't sound like probably in the same vocabulary you do. We talk about justice, we talk about our values, we talk about access. So I think we're having a lot of the same conversations, just using different vocabulary. But you all have probably the ability to provide us tools and perspectives from a beginning discussion place that would be so valuable and make this work so much more effective for all of us, and particularly for the residents that we serve. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Adam.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and I am absolutely going to sort of build upon a lot of what Liz said, and really share some what are hopefully some interesting and also actionable ideas for folks to sort of take out of this room, and maybe sort of things to think about come Monday morning. I guess this. I screwed up a little bit, and this was not supposed to be on the screen like the entire time Liz was talking, but by now you know exactly who I am, and you know exactly sort of the people I'm thanking, and where the funding came for what I'm about to say. So there are many sort of bioethicists who have written about sort of the role of sort of bioethics and bioethicists in the policy process, and a lot of and so a couple of the examples are up on the screen right now, but there are many others. And they're really sort of largely about kind of the supply of policy engagement. Basically sort of what role should bioethicists play? What role have they played? What role could they play? And so on and so forth. And that's it's super interesting stuff. I know I personally have learned a lot from reading what other folks have written along these lines. What I want to start talking about here, and this very much is going to sort of build upon what Liz just talked about, is the demand, which is a slightly different question, which is to say, what experiences do policymakers already have engaging with bioethicists, and what kind of engagement do they want to have? And kind of picking up on sort of what Liz said, a lot of what I'm going to talk about really is focused on the local level and a little bit on sort of the state level. And part of that is because not everybody can sort of be storming down the halls of Congress. And in fact, a lot of the local stuff is arguably much more accessible to people in the room. All of you are from across the country and or across the world. And the local level is often sort of, particularly given kind of the nationalization of news media, can be easily overlooked and is not always as accessible. And so a lot of sort of the decision to focus on the local level is very much sort of with actionable ideas in mind. And so in particular, I'm going to sort of present some results from some what are called Unmet Desire surveys. And I first wrote about the idea of doing Unmet Desire surveys. This was published in 2022. It's it's a little hard to see the icon, but anyway, if you look at the upper left, it's the Issues in Science and Technology magazine. But this is going to sort of build on that. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is present the results of 3 Unmet Desire surveys. These are all national level surveys, and they're all going to speak to this question, this demand question. What role do policymakers to what extent are policymakers already interacting with bioethicists? And to what extent do they want to be going forward? And also, what kind of hesitations might they have? These surveys were conducted between September and October of 2023. This is very fresh data. This is like sushi grade data, okay? And so like I got the results from Civic Pulse, which is the survey firm, an amazing survey firm that has incredible access to local and state policymakers across the country. I got this yesterday morning, the final data yesterday morning. So I got some preliminary stuff last week, coded everything up, but then like ran the final analyses yesterday. So what are the three surveys? So one is local government elected policymakers, so like Liz, for example. The second would be local government top appointed executives, so like say like a city manager, okay, county executive, folks like that. And then the third is going to be civil service staff in local and state government, and in particular those who provide family support services. So not all of them, but particularly family support services kinds of folks. Right? And let me just kind of give you a little bit of a snapshot before I sort of talk about some of the results, but let me just give you a little bit of snapshot about kind of what these surveys looked like. So the overall structure, each of these three surveys was exactly the same in terms of like the wording and the structure and all that kind of stuff, and so it was just to different people. So first, folks were asked about the nature of their health-related decision-making. Basically, to what extent do they see themselves as making tough decisions that affect the health of their community, okay? Then they were asked about their recent collaborative relationships with bioethicists. Again, the reason why there's this focus on collaborative relationships is exactly what Liz just mentioned before. We're sort of thinking about sort of not just can you like tweet at them, but rather sort of are you engaging with them or not? And they want it, right? You know, I mean, you're hearing that. And I'm happy to sort of, I actually have question wording. I'm like an academic who like comes prepared, right? So like if folks like have any like specific questions along those lines, there was a little bit of a preamble about sort of like these are what, who bioethicists are. I know that different people have different definitions of the term bioethicist, and we tried to kind of, or I tried to, in consultation with amazing colleagues, like other people on the stage right now, tried to come up with sort of a preamble that kind of made sense for a broad audience. And I will also say that, in large part, and this kind of echoes what Liz talked about as well, a lot of sort of, what we're going to be talking about here are very much kind of like the part of bioethics that is focused on kind of public health. And I get that, like, that's not all of it. But I just want to sort of like say, like, up front that that's what we focused on in large part because public health related decisions are very much kind of in the purview of local policymakers. Okay, so anyway, so we asked about recent collaborative relationships with bioethicists and then desired. Okay, so that was the overall structure. All right, so let me sort of present some of the findings. And this is like the big reveal. All of you are at like the world premiere of this data, okay? So this is like really exciting. And these are just gonna be descriptive. I'm gonna be presenting some means. There's gonna be some 95% confidence intervals on there. I guess, if there's any other like survey wonks in the room, I'll just say that one thing that's also great about Civic Pulse, the survey firm, is that they give you weights, post-stratification weights. And so all of the data for the local policymakers and the top appointed executives are weighted to increase sample representativeness, okay? So anyway, so the first, you kind of see, I mean, the title of the slide kind of gives away the kind of the punchline here, right? But there's been very little recent interaction. Now, I do want to be clear before I even like show the bar graphs that we explicitly asked about whether or not they'd interacted with bioethicists over the past year. And I get that if we had asked this question, say, 2 years ago, the answers might look very different, possibly.
I don't think they would have.
Liz actually doesn't think they would. But this was like a very deliberate choice, okay? And so to sort of say, like, during kind of more, quote-unquote, normal times, what do things look like, okay? So I wanted to sort of, like, state that up front. And that was, and there was a lot of debate around that. So here's the percent who interacted with a bioethicist at least once. Like at least once, okay? And so, and what you see is that it's about 10% more or less for all three types of folks: policymakers, appointed officials, and civil service. If you're taking pictures, I'm happy to smile. I have no food in my teeth. Okay, so not that much. And again, this is over the past year. So then another question was like, well, okay, but maybe like, is that because like essentially bioethicists are constantly sending them emails and they're just not responding to the emails? Like, who are these people? Well, not so much. So this is the percent who had a bioethicist reach out to them unprompted at all over the past year. And again, what you see is it's about 10% or so, a little bit higher for civil servants. So then so that's sort of like largely the kind of like the existing already. And there are some other findings that are part of the survey, but I'm not going to sort of like, in the interest of time, I'm not presenting like all the like, nooks and crannies. And so the question was like, all right, well, what about going forward? Like, do they want more interaction? And so now this is looking at all respondents for all 3 of the different samples. And what we see is that the percentage who say that they want more collaborative relationships with bioethicists than they currently have is 40%, it's about 40%, and then it's about 50% for civil servants. Which, I mean, it's hard. I want to sort of impress upon you that, like, this is sort of people sort of saying that, like, yeah, like, I want to be interacting with these people more than I am. And I think, this is, maybe I'm too much of a glass half full kind of guy, but, like, these numbers are extraordinary. I mean, this is a very, very good base to build on. This suggests, look, is everybody sort of, sitting around waiting? Okay, maybe not. But there's definitely a sense in which, we're pushing against an open door. One other thing, and I know Liz actually also wants to add something on this, which is, what about if we focus on, so remember I said, like, the very beginning of the survey, we asked people, to what extent did they even see themselves as making tough decisions related to protecting and promoting the health of their community? And so approximately 88% of respondents said that they do, and we gave them a couple of different options of like what that could look like. So protecting the most vulnerable, resource allocation decisions, decisions in response to other levels of government. Liz can definitely talk a lot about that, I know, but, and so the question was basically, do they see themselves as making any of these kinds of tough decisions? So around 88% of respondents, almost all, but not everybody, said yes. And when we only focus on those folks, then we see even more folks who say, yes, I would love to. And, so it goes up to over 50% for the policymakers, close to 60% for civil servants, and then slightly lower for appointed officials.
And I would add here, I think there is a level, I think this is actually probably much higher in reality, because there's a level of we don't know what we don't know in some of these spaces. And there's also a really important dynamic, depending on the community you live in or the type of leader you were talking to, about how we define public health information. And so in my county, in the June of 2020, we declared racism as a public health crisis and established a working group that brought many folks from around the county government together to tackle structural racism challenges in our community that are impacting the literal health outcomes of Black and brown people in our community. And I don't know that, I know these conversations are happening in cities and counties all across the country. Whether they put it in that framework or not is another question. And so part of this often we are challenged by in public spaces is we tend to be very siloed. Like, there are national associations of county elected officials, just like you have this great association here. But those things are much more geared towards like celebrating outcomes and having frank conversations about lobbying needs of how we transform federal policy to give us more flexibility. It is very rarely used in establishing uniform concepts and ideas about what is public health, how do we have a shared vocabulary. And so I think there's some big gaps here that you all could help bridge for us in communities around the country.
And so there's really like a lot of ways in which, it is not unreasonable to look at these percentages, which I think are already like quite high, and say, actually, these might be like really the floor. Mm-hmm. So many more, I think, it is reasonable to say, based on that data, many want more interaction. So then the question becomes, well, but, are they hesitant, right? I mean, because they may or may not be very familiar with bioethicists and whatnot. They might not have thought much about it. And so, so we also, on the survey, we asked a number of different statements where we just said, to what extent do you share any of these kinds of concerns? And they just had to click yes or no. I won't completely fill in this table because honestly, I'll eat up the lunchtime. But but anyway, I just want to highlight the two most frequent hesitations that folks mentioned. It turns out actually that they were consistent across all 3 samples. Which was, first, actually I'll start with the bottom one. They may push a political agenda. That was, now granted, I mean, I don't want to overstate it too much, right? This is certainly not, we're not talking about large majorities of people, but, pretty sizable number of people sort of saying that. And that was, again, the most frequent concern that people expressed. And then also they might not have practical information. And one thing I'm just going to say about the practical information point is I've done these kinds of unmet desire surveys with, focused on a number of different kinds of collaborative relationships. And one thing that is interesting here is that if you compare what's all the way up top, which is they may not have domain-specific expertise, that one was much less of a concern. And so there's a gap between sort of having domain-specific expertise, everything about bioethics there is to know, versus having practical information that's useful for me as a policymaker.
I'll jump in on this one and say this is the piece where the biggest frustration for a public official is when you get a concerned citizen who comes in and makes a demand of you, and you're like, I literally have no jurisdiction over this matter, right? Like the layers of government are complicated, or the thing you're asking me to do because of federal guidelines, state guidelines, whatever that is, we cannot do it. There's a little bit of, to put this in a different way, we get a little PTSD situations with public electeds where the folks the moments we internalize from when we have the most public participation are often these moments where we have a lot of angry, frustrated folks who show up, and the effort is spent to educate and redirect versus solve the problem, so everyone leaves the room very unhappy and dissatisfied. The public meetings I think of that have been the most contentious and challenging for us have been about animal control and sewers. Like, you want to fill a room, put something about sewers in a public notice, and you got standing room only. But when it comes to making tough public health decisions, and so remember that for a lot of policymakers and for a lot of local electeds, it is not that we don't believe you have value to add. It's that we're often kind of like a little gun shy on, what is it you're coming for here today, and what is it you expect out of us? So a lot of these meetings and building relationships are so important from it.
Oh, thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. So a couple other things. And so first of all, I want to sort of just raise 2 FAQs, and then I'm going to sort of segue into the, okay, now what next, moving forward kind of part, and which will be the end of my presentation. So first of all, a common question that comes up with these unmet desire surveys, especially in this climate, I think, especially after COVID, but even before COVID, is there a partisan difference in unmet desire? And so the answer is yes, there is. I have a slide. It's actually at the end. It's in the extra slide section of this deck, but like where I'm happy to show what those numbers look like. I don't want to overstate it too much, okay? And so, in terms of the question, what proportion of policymakers want more interaction than they currently have? If, let's say, the overall percentages are around 50%, so half, let's say, so for Democrats, it'll be maybe 60%. For Republicans, it'll go down to about 30, okay? And so, is there a difference? Absolutely. We are still seeing across the data, across all of the samples, approximately 1/3 of Republicans who are saying yes. And then again, upwards of about 2/3 of Democrats who are saying yes. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. The second is, look, this is a survey, and people are answering these closed-ended questions. To what extent do you want, basically to be interacting with bioethicists, a lot more than you currently are, somewhat more, the same, less, whatever. And so, you might reasonably ask, look, how meaningful is this? And of course, the answer is, right, it is highly unlikely that if we were to go out, literally this afternoon, cancel all your other plans, this afternoon we're going to contact local policymakers all across the country and expect that 60% of them are going to be like, oh, thank goodness you called, okay? Yeah, that's probably not going to happen. But there was an open-ended question on the survey too, which asked, look, what kinds of issues would you like to engage with? And everybody received this. And 25% of respondents wrote something in that text box. And I think that is really meaningful, right? Because this is now an open-ended question. They had to come up with it, right? They had to put the words together, right? And put them on the screen. And let me tell you, the issues ran the gamut. People talked about homelessness. They talked about mental health. They talked about infrastructure. They talked about land use. I mean, it was all over the place, which reflects sort of all the ways in which sort of the political agenda at the local level often doesn't mirror what's happening in national politics and is highly variable. So anyway, I want to just kind of state that. I'm happy to say more about either of those points during the Q&A. So moving forward, and this is I'm going to just talk for a couple more minutes and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So the question is sort of all right, so when Andy first asked us to do this plenary, right, he was I want you to say something interesting, but also let's something actionable, or kind of actionable, or motioning towards actionable. And so I wanted to kind of yeah, talk about this. So the question is sort of look, let's say we have inspired you, or at least if not, we have 40 minutes left to inspire you, right? To say look, yeah, I maybe haven't thought about sort of interacting with local policymakers before. Maybe I should be thinking about it, or I want to talk to colleagues about it, or whatever. The question is sort of all right, what can be done? And so I think one strategy is the kind of self-service strategy. And I think, Liz, you probably could even say even more about this. I mean, what this can look like is simply like sort of like going to the meetings, going to say county legislature meetings or board of supervisors meetings or council meetings, and just seeing like what is it that they're talking about. I mean, and there's usually actually open mic portions, and you can even speak then. And so, I'll just, as somebody, I've done that, and so here's some of the selfies I have to prove it, in highly variable weather conditions.
Yeah.
I was trying to be very consistent, so I'm wearing the same sweater and jacket in every single one of these pictures. Anyway, and this was sort of, and I would just go, and this was, part of a separate project that I was conducting, that was funded by the William T. Grant Foundation. Where I attended meetings and often would sort of, in some of them I would speak during the kind of privilege of the floor portions. Now I think, it's very easy, of course, to say like, oh yes, all of you should go do that. But of course, I know as much as all of you do that, folks are busy. This kind of work is not always incentivized. I think there's probably people in the room, and if you're in this room, you're probably at least somewhat motivated by it, but nevertheless, like there are other real pressures. And as I just revealed, right, like I was doing this in part because I was funded by the William T. Grant Foundation. And so I get that that's not everybody's case. And I'm not always funded when I do this stuff, but that's where these pictures came from. And so I think that that is a very real thing that, to put on the table. So there is the other question, strategy, right, which is to sort of leverage third parties. And I think that I'm not going to say that I think that these kinds of matchmakers necessarily exist. They might, and I'm sure actually many of you probably know about matchmakers that are out there that I don't know about. This is not intended as an advertisement for Research for Impact, which is a matchmaker, but actually has not typically done sort of local policymaker related matching. But to think about sort of how can we sort of institutionalize this work so that given that folks are busy, given that it's not always incentivized right now, at least can we sort of, kind of harness the enthusiasm that people have for sort of being engaged in the policy process, and at least try to make it as easy as possible, to create the opportunities to make it as easy as possible. And I think the matchmakers, like, that kind of third party could be really, really critical for that. So anyway, with that said, this slide's going to go back up, but now it's going to come down. We're not going to keep it up. There we go. And thank you so much.
Yeah.
So thank you both so much, both for being here and for that really interesting, I think, start to a conversation. As Adam said, we have a fair amount of time now to discuss. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Kahn. I am the director of the Berman Institute of Bioethics at Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore. So I should say, since I have the microphone, welcome to Baltimore. We're really pleased to have you in our city. Hope you're enjoying the weather that we have every day of the year is like this in Baltimore. Okay, the other thing I should say is Adam and Andy and I share something which is Michigan. So since you called out Ohio, I sort of have to say both of my children and lots of my money went to the University of Michigan, and so we have to say go blue in response to that. Okay, all right, so I think we're gonna do the questions and comments like we have for the other plenaries. If you'd line up at the microphone, we'll do that. I'm gonna take privilege of the moderator and ask the first, but please, if you'd queue up, that would help. So, really interesting, and I will say just in my own work, and I think most of my colleagues here at Johns Hopkins, our focus has not been local. It's almost always state, we get invited, or federal, because we get invited, right? So it's a little bit of we respond to the people who ask for our help. So one thing just to ask of both of you is sort of what makes the most sense to actually have impact? Like where's most effective and most efficient? It feels like we have a chance at a bigger impact if we work at the higher level, but that doesn't sound like what you're saying is actually right. So we've got it upside down if that's true. So that would be, for me, first question to you both.
How much time do I have? So listen, I think there's a couple key points to answer that, which is, one, as you think about engaging in local government, one of the most important things you can do to save yourself a lot of time and energy is to do a little bit of power mapping and understand where does the buck really stop? Some communities have elected officials that are more kind of figureheads, and then they have a city manager that's hired and is responsible for implementing government. Or they have 3 commissioners, whatever those things are, kind of figure out who those spaces are. In my county, I'll say one of the most powerful people in local government is the fiscal officer, right? Is the person who manages the budget for all of our work. And I keep coming back to this thing and talking about the dollar amount, right? Money, but like money is how we express our priorities. Our budgets are ethical documents. And some of those budgets, a lot of those budgets are guided again by federal or state directives and how much allocation we're getting from a certain program to serve certain needs. But there's a lot of decision and nuance that happens, decision making and nuance that happens at the local level to decide how to spend other things or to collaboratively problem solve in and among like county, city, and other governmental actors as problems present themselves. So I think figuring out where to go is and who kind of where the buck stops and working in that space is really important. But number 2, I say this again, I always say this with love of my local folks. We're just not as, there's a lot of ceremony and pomp around visiting Congress or visiting your state legislature, and that's great. We don't really do that locally. We don't have time for that, right? And we're not built for that. We have an 11-member council. We have 3 staff for all of us to run the whole county, right? So we have, we'll have a 15-minute discussion on something really important, public health related, like vaccine access. And then 15 minutes later, we're talking about how a pothole's getting filled. So while all these big, hard, ethical questions happen, there's still someone that has to make the lights turn on and the trains run on time. And so sometimes these big ethical questions kind of sit here unanswered in the desire to just like continue to provide services. Probably a poorly timed example given what's happening in Washington right now, but like the rest of us don't get to just not have somebody in charge for weeks at a time. That's not a thing for most of us, right? So when we talk about, right, what is possible, that's just a perfect example of like, we all need, Congress has to function for us to survive in the long term, but it is very, very, very disconnected from the day-to-day lives of citizens in this country. It is not, and it's not connected to providing any services, any care, any support on a daily basis. And so as you think about that in going into this, and I hope you all do, I hope you go home and attend a meeting. Other great matchmakers that are nonpartisan, like League of Women Voters, if you've got a chapter in your state, they are still phenomenal spaces for that civic engagement. Other folks that, like Adam mentioned. But even if that's not your speed, because of COVID, almost all of us now have broadcast meetings. So you can kind of dip your toe in it by watching us on Facebook. Spoiler alert, it's boring as hell. Like it is like watching paint dry unless the animal control activists show up, then buckle up. But like the kind of minutia of getting things done that's kind of the most important work we do, right? If you want high drama and must-see TV, Congress is your people. If you want results and outcomes, you got to get involved in the slow, boring work of local government.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just, this is why I'm really excited that like Liz and I are here doing this together because, so I can answer sort of Jeff's question kind of from the perspective of somebody who has actually done some of this. Mm-hmm. I guess I'll just say 2 things. One is when I have done visits to county legislatures, which have just been completely unprompted. I just go and because they're open meetings, and maybe I speak during the privilege of the floor to talk about some public health related issue or whatever. I have very frequently had people sort of say to me like, we have never had somebody from like a university come here before. And especially maybe, and either from a university at all, or certainly one that maybe is not local, if there happens to be a local one. So there's a little bit of a kind of, there is that reaction. I guess the other thing too is I have not done nearly as much sort of national level policy work as some of my colleagues in health policy management at Bloomberg, but I have done some. And some of that has originated from connections that I made at the local and the state level. Mm-hmm. And so I also think it's just sort of, and again, it's totally fine. I've also done where I sort of show up at the Canon office building and I just I'm like, hey, I'd like to have, I have some meetings or whatever. And that's certainly a thing to do and that's fine. But also there are ways in which sort of getting to know what's going on and, and gaining experience with sort of engaging with like elected and non-elected policymakers at like other levels of government can then sort of like lead to connections. And so that you're not just some rando walking into a meeting in the Canon building, but yet, they're like, you've already been introduced.
I'm gonna say one more thing, sorry. And then, the other thing for, I think, folks to just kind of keep in mind as you think about this work is that there used to be, probably about 30 years ago is when this really started to change, is there was this kind of natural order to public life. Like you'd run for your city council, you'd serve in your county government, you'd go to your state legislature, you'd go to Congress. And social media in particular has really flipped that on its head. And so there are people serving in Congress who've never touched a public budget in their life, who, I mean, the list goes on. And there's still, don't get me wrong, plenty of good, talented public servants. But the expectations of what experience people come to this work with, even at the state legislative level, has completely flipped on its head. So I think the gap between policy making in the US House chamber and the Senate chamber and implementing a public program in a county government has never been wider. And the space that you can fill to help bring those things together, or that other subject matter expertise folks can fill to bring those things together, it is really important, and it is particularly unique to this moment in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time.
Super helpful. Okay, so our right, your left, let's just alternate between the two microphones, so please.
Okay, thank you. I just have an overall clarification framing question. So I guess this call, are you asking for bioethicists to volunteer, or are you telling us that governments are ready to recognize our expertise and our training and adequately compensate us?
Yeah, great question. You know, let me be really clear, like at the county level or at the city level, and this is not true everywhere, but in states like Ohio, where our state government is hostile to taxes, you guys don't ever put your phones down, but like things cost money, right? And paying experts and hiring good people and running sufficient social services, it takes funds. And as you've seen across the country, and this is, I'm revealing my partisanship a bit here, but the two parties have very different perspectives on what the role of government should be and then how we pay for that. And so I think there are some states in this country where, yes, you will find that there is much more willingness and frankly resources to do that, whereas other states, like where I'm from, and we are mandated under state law to balance our budget every year. So it is often the choice, we are making really hard choices about what services to balance upon without making cuts. And so I think in some of these spaces, the ask is to be more assertive and be an expert if you're willing, as a citizen and as a member of your democracy. And in some other states, there is much more opportunity for growth and expansion. And I think in places like, LA, for example, where they're having really thoughtful questions about housing and the ethics of how you manage a homelessness situation, I wouldn't be surprised, or I think there's probably much more openness and resources available to institutionalize a role like this in the local government level. So I think it's case by case.
I guess, and so thank you for that question.
Yeah.
And your question very much echoes a question that I get a lot when people first learn about research for impact, which research for impact is largely connecting nonprofit practitioners with researchers. But this question of sort of like, it usually gets phrased in terms of, it's slightly different from the way that you asked it, but just because the context is a little bit different. But basically sort of like, how do you get people to talk to each other? Like, is it hard? I mean, because people aren't getting paid usually. Sometimes it leads to research projects, but oftentimes it's for strategic knowledge exchange. And at least what I found so far, my experiences have been that there's at least enough people who are sort of like kind of chomping at the bit to at least have some of those kinds of interactions. Like not all the time, not every day, but at least to some extent. And so this is just sort of making it easier for them. But it is uncompensated. That's absolutely right. And so it's sort of, there's a little bit of sort of like intrinsic motivation and sort of, again, a little bit of sort of pushing against an open door for people who are already sort of thinking, well, I'd like to do it to some extent. And because, and I guess the last thing I'll just say is, and this is more just on the researcher side with that stuff, that, they often sort of like gain insights into sort of what problems are people in the world facing that I don't necessarily encounter every day? And also, like, to what extent does the research literature, like, speak to that? And, like, are there things that, should the research agenda maybe look different than in ways that I hadn't thought about before because there are these problems out in the world that maybe I just hadn't thought about before? And so at least I hear that on that side. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to this side. I think that's Robert.
Robert Klitzman from Columbia University. That was a great panel. Thank you. I'm wondering whether local leaders draw on other sets of experts that might be relevant. So infectious disease experts, public health experts, Do they come? Do you draw on them? Or the people you call on? Are there lessons that we might learn from that? And how much might be just involved with sort of educating local leaders about what bioethicists might bring to the table?
So you're teeing up the perfect question, because Adam and I were talking about this morning, is if I could give you one piece of advice if you do embark on this work, come to the table first as an educator. Again, I rattled off the list of people I serve in council with. I don't think any one of them would be like, so why is there an ethicist here? What do you do? Like, that would be, there's a lot of teaching, I think, space there, and I think you'll find that for the most part we're receptive to it. But I do think, and this is where I kind of will call out the urgency, is often we don't rely on subject matter experts until something incredibly disruptive or chaotic happens that we are under a public scrutiny to respond to. So COVID is a great example. We've never had so many MDs and public health experts in the chamber, right? And it was because we were asking really hard questions and trying to find really hard answers on how to respond, how to invest dollars. Same with our opiate abatement money. We've had a lot of addiction experts come in and brief us. Some of these stuff don't always happen in the chamber. It happens in working groups outside of our public meetings. So there's a lot of space there as well. I think starting as a teacher first and building those relationships would be really important. I think as we've come through these, let me back up and say it this way. Up and again, how social media has changed this work, on how accessibility has changed this work, everyone online is now an expert. Everyone, right? And so, and the ability of people to watch us make decisions real time and weigh in, and most of them are voters, and so elected officials feel very under an immense amount of pressure to be responsive to that commentary. I think more than ever we are hungry for tools and for people to help us build the right tools from the beginning to inform decision making along the way, rather than trying to sort out messes after the fact, which is often how public money moves. And for decades, no one really knew any of that because you didn't see it and you weren't able to weigh in on Twitter on a daily basis. So thank you. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, so I couldn't help but sort of laugh immediately, because this morning I said to Liz, I had to decide which survey evidence to report and whatever. And so it turns out in the survey there were other questions that asked about where they seek counsel. And in fact, we gave a list of folks, and so like local business leaders, other kinds of national organizations, other researchers from colleges in your region, outside your region, and so on and so forth. And the most frequent, and it was very much, the question was very much like all of the questions were, along the lines of, when you are, addressing sort of tough decisions around health in your community. Business leaders and community groups were much more prevalent than researchers, so first of all, than bioethicists, but also than researchers at colleges and universities in your region, outside your region, or anything like that. And so there's a really interesting, I think, broader argument here to be made about kind of the role of just sort of academia and research kind of in the broader society. So, thanks.
Maybe I'll just make a quick observation and then we'll come to this side, which is I think many of us got consulted around COVID-related public health issues, but it didn't feel like our advice or expertise or education actually made a difference. It didn't get acted on. At least that's how it felt. So I don't know that you need to respond to that, but I think that's part of what we, how will we know that we're successful in offering the help that we're discussing? We can talk about that maybe in relation to some of the other answers. But,
sure.
Okay.
Wait, actually, can we address that?
Okay, go ahead.
Well, just one quick thing to say,
ahead.
that there is, I think, there can be, and I know people say this to me sometimes, that there can be this sort of idea that what it means to sort of use evidence or use research is that it immediately leads to a new decision. And that certainly can happen, and evidence-based policy can maybe sometimes look like that, but a lot of times I think, and there's some really interesting research on that involves surveys of policymakers, where they ask about sort of the way in which they want to interact with how they sort of want to use research evidence and whatnot, and oftentimes more conceptual use is certainly more common, so basically to inform understanding of an issue. And then there's also political uses, to sort of be viewed as credible, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but to be viewed as credible to one's colleagues, to build a coalition of support, and things like that. And so it's really interesting how the kind of conceptual and political uses tend to be more frequent than the instrumental. But.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a couple examples of where we've had feedback real time, but are really constrained by things outside of it. Here's a great example, right, of like the COVID relief money that was passed to county governments and city governments. And it was probably some of the most liberal federal money we've ever gotten, right, where there wasn't a whole lot of definition on what you could do. There was a whole lot of don't do this or else, right? And particularly because it was in the midst of a presidential election, everyone was kind of like, well, do we just break the rules and hope a different person gets elected? Like there was a lot of those conversations happening across the country. But it's a great example of like, as you make these moral decisions of, you know, we were not allowed to use COVID relief money to maintain county employees that were otherwise threatened because of decreases in other revenue, or they were serving in jobs that, like, frankly, because of COVID, we didn't need to have, you know, serving. And it's just such kind of an irrational decision point of saying, well, I can't use that money to fund your salary and healthcare, but I can use it to fund your increase on your unemployment benefits. Like, that's not rational. Like, why would we? Because we can keep them on our payroll and reassign them into other work in the community that would have helped keep child care center open or keep mental health and disability services moving, because those were so hampered during COVID. But because of federal regulation, we're often not empowered to make some of these more creative on-the-fly decision-making. So like, that's not a perfect example, but I think to the question here of like, you guys have expertise and you give it and it's not always followed, sometimes it's not because of lack of will, it's because of lack of ability. And that's where the complicated, you know, patchwork of government really can be challenging.
Yeah, very helpful. Okay, here.
Hi, my name is Rick Weinmeier. I'm at the DePaul University College of Law, and my question actually kind of builds off what you guys were just talking about now. And I was kind of interested in your perspectives or what the research says on these kind of structural barriers. So I was thinking like gerrymandering or preemption and how that constrains your ability to undertake decision making.
So much. You know, and again, it's state by state, and it is kind of state legislature by state legislature. And I think part of the challenge, I acknowledge this up front, is that when I say every state is different, every state is different. And so you kind of have to go into this on your own path of learning for where you're engaging. But here's a really great example of, you know, how this played out in COVID in Ohio. For the first three months of the lockdown, Governor DeWine and our then health director, Dr. Amy Acton, would give daily briefings, and she became this like phenomenon. Little girls all over Ohio were dressing in white coats and posting their social media, and like became this really beloved figure. And she was giving the right medical advice, and the governor had her back through the entire process. And he was under immense pressure to walk away from that and to make different decisions about how they were going to administer public health rules across the state. And so at first there was a universal lockdown of schools, and then after 3 months there was quite a bit of public protesting, including armed protesters that showed up at Dr. Acton's house. And really quickly, everything started to change. And so public schools were then allowed to make their own decision, which of course led in some districts, they reopened despite public medical advice. And in some districts they did not, which then, moving past the health outcomes there, you also have now retroactively much different disparities in learning outcomes as a result of some of those decisions. And then finally went to a place where all schools were mandated to open, which led to labor negotiation problems, like a whole piece of, so like all of this is interconnected and has a huge impact especially when there's conflict or lack of ability for unified decision making about like that centers health, safety, and all those things. But in particular in states where we've had that breakdown of local government wanting to do something that they know is right for their community, and then run into barriers at the state government to implement that, or worse, we've had a few issues in Ohio where the state government has proactively taken away our rights to home rule on things like environmental policy, gun policy, minimum wage policy, where every time a local entity moves to legislate to do something they think is right for community health, the state proactively takes the ability for us to do that away. And that is kind of the gross part of politics, right? That's not policy, that's politics, and this is where they intersect in often unhelpful ways for us.
I think I'll take a bye.
Okay, good. we have lots of people waiting to talk, so that's okay. Over here,
Good
please.
afternoon. My name is Andrea Kalfaglu, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, about 20 minutes away from here. I'm an old timer and remember the days where we debated who was allowed to call themselves a bioethicist. And so my question is, have I missed the boat, and has the new generation of master's level trained bioethicists, are you calling yourselves bioethicists? Because when I listened to your presentation of data, Adam, I'm very engaged in activism work. I am testifying in the General Assembly. I'm commenting on proposed regulations with CMS. I never present myself as a bioethicist. I present myself as an associate professor of public health with training in policy and ethics. And then the second question I have is maybe for Jeff and others in the room, how do we convince our departments that this is merit-worthy work when we talk about promotion and tenure, rather than writing papers and bringing in external grant money?
So thank you for those questions, and I'll say, at least in response to the first part, this was many conversations were had about sort of how to design the survey, and I spoke quite a bit with Jeff actually, as well as others, about sort of that term, which is the term bioethicist does appear in the questions in the survey, and we spoke at length about sort of the ways in which sort of people disagree on the use of that term and what it means, but at the same time, we were sort of thinking, well, but we need something that's sort of legible for our respondents. And like what is sort of like, in a way, and this is where sort of Civic Pulse, the survey firm, is actually really, was really good about sort of also providing guidance on that, as well as sort of speaking to Liz. And it was a real challenge. And it actually sort of underscored, it's very interesting, like the experience of writing this survey. And again, as somebody like I would not generally self-identify as a bioethicist either. As like the process of writing the survey was almost its own exercise in sort of how to make sort of like expertise legible to new audiences. And in a way that sort of would make sure that people would not, basically stop taking the survey. And so we ended up using the term, but with, and I'm happy afterwards to show, like I literally have the question wordings here, kind of like the language we use to sort of define what we mean. So we didn't just like throw the term in, but we, gave like a brief definition.
Can I chime in here with one answer too, just as food for thought for you all, is that we now live in an age of influencers, and that's it. That's full stop. Influencers, right? With expertise being a nice to have, not a need to have. If you've got 1 million followers on TikTok, people will take you seriously. So everything you're saying, like those are real questions, but I think for you all as policy experts, like get in there, right? Throw your elbows around, because otherwise, we had a public health expert testify before the State House who said COVID vaccine made her magnetic and stuck a key to herself. Like, that's real. And so I wouldn't let your, like the perception of your expert, like the terminology keep you out of the debate, because unfortunately, because of the nature of the influence culture we live in, there are far too many people who don't belong in the debate getting the seat and the spotlight, so.
So let me just respond, because Andrea asked me specifically, and Adam's already said that we spent probably an hour actually talking just about the sort of how to describe the expertise and the ability to offer information that we're discussing. And I think it's important what you just said, and that there's a description of what the term that gets used in the survey is meant to include, which I think is broad enough, Andrea, that you would have recognized yourself in it. So it wasn't presented in the slides that Adam had, but I felt good about the outcome of that. To answer your second question about how to convince departments and those who are reviewing, promotion and tenure and things, I think this kind of work speaks to reputation. Certainly when you're doing things at, the State House or in the federal government, but I think also at the local level, if you are providing education and tools, that speaks to your reputation as somebody who has a particular expertise and something to offer. So it feels like it's worth using it in that category. I guess the question of how much you do is maybe what you're focusing on, and I don't think any of us think of it as something we do instead of writing grants or writing papers. So that would be my quick response. Okay, I think we're to this side of the room. Have I lost track? Or this way? Oh, okay. Rachel, hey.
Hi, thank you. Rachel Faby. I'm an associate professor of bioethics and humanities at SUNY Upstate. And that question perfectly teed up what I want to ask. So I think this session and yesterday's plenary have made it really clear that there's an appetite for us to be involved also, right? Like we want to know how we can work with policymakers. But I think in my training as a bioethicist, and even recently in a very public forum, I heard a leader in our field say that it is dangerous for bioethicists to be involved in lobbying, in advocacy, that it undermines our independence as scholars. I disagree with that take, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that sort of normative, we should not be doing this because it undermines our field.
We all have thoughts about that, I'm sure.
So I guess I'll say a couple of things. And again, I'm definitely going to be speaking from, so my field, I mean, I'm in the public health department here. I mean, I guess my field in the sense of my PhD would be political science. I think those are absolutely sort of valid concerns. And I definitely hear people in political science and in public health who say those kinds of things. I guess to me, what it really sort of comes down to is different ways of sort of engaging. And I think that the form of I know that advocacy I think can mean different things to different people, just in the same way that collaboration can mean different things to different people. And so I think it does come down to kind of what how is it that you're engaging, and what are you saying, and how are you sort of presenting the information, and are you presenting it in ways that are meant to sort of say this is what the kind of the research says and that's it, versus saying this is my recommendation or not, or things like that. And I think that question of whether folks are giving policy recommendations as well as sort of sharing research results is quite that difference matters. Particularly relative to what you said. I guess just two other things on this. One is I'm very much sort of sidestepping, and I'm not a super social media user, so I have not had the experience of the social media mob yet, please. And so I am sidestepping the very important question, I think, of sort of what happens when sort of people start threatening you online. Which I think is a very important topic, but I'm sidestepping it for lack of experience. The other thing too, and something else I also really wanted to kind of comment on, and it speaks to your question and it does expand a little bit. The one other thing that we really haven't mentioned too is the idea that I think the politics of expertise is really interesting, and from a real world perspective and from an academic perspective, but also that not everybody's expertise is socially recognized at all times. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also really important. And in fact, actually, one of the things when I talk about the kind of self-service strategy, I often sort of talk about that as well, that, that different people are going to be taken seriously, in different ways. And that could be related to all sorts of, especially demographic attributes and, and professional associations and things like that. And I think that that's also really important to recognize. And one nice thing, potentially, about the third-party kind of matchmaking route is it can, at least in theory, not always in practice, but in theory, help to kind of try to level the playing field and try to sort of make sure that expertise that might not otherwise be socially recognized is.
I have lots to say about this too, and I think you know that, but I want to make sure that we get to everybody who's waiting in line. We've only got 5 more minutes, so let's maybe talk in the break. Okay, this side.
Hi, I'm Bill Sexton, a bioethicist at Emory University. This is pretty specifically for Liz. One of the things that happens in bioethics is we usually deal with contentious positions on a feeling about something. Mm-hmm. So that because we're thrust into the middle of that contention, mm-hmm. oftentimes as I teach policy and legislative advocacy at Emory, I'm confronted with the fact that I don't go into a discussion with a politician about what the right thing to do is. I go in with what my position is on that. And it's really easy to talk with a politician or somebody in political life who agrees with you. Yeah. The really tough thing is what to do when you're talking with somebody who contentiously disagrees with you.
Yeah.
What I'd really like your opinion on, thoughts on, is how do we talk with people who hold diametrically opposed views with us and enter into a collaborative discussion that's productive, not just contentious?
Yeah, man. And this kind of ties into the question from someone over here too about gerrymandering and some of the other structural things that I think have led us to a point in our public politics where in many cases contention is rewarded these days in the public sphere versus collaboration. And in many ways there seems to be it's much more high stakes these days to be a collaborative leader and to work across the aisle than it is to try to build coalition within your own party and not have a centered debate. So I just want to acknowledge that it's hard, and I don't know that I have the perfect advice for you. I mean, I will say, you know, this is a tough spot because this kind of blurs the line between you guys as professionals and then you guys as citizens who care deeply, I would hope, about your communities and our country. This is where relationships matter. And so, you know, one of my closest colleagues on council is my Republican counterpart who tried to convince me to get a stock of ivermectin during COVID. And so we had some really interesting conversations, right? But we also were able to find, like, when you have the ability to kind of get past their public role and get to know people as individuals, whether that's, you know, over 1 or 2 lunches a year or even more than that, you just create more space for an open discussion about, and you get more understanding to how people developed that worldview. And there will be a subset of electeds, and this is true on both sides of the aisle, who are truly, you know, unwilling to compromise, who have kind of, to the far left or the far right, pretty bold policy beliefs. And to be blunt, they're not worth your time to change their mind, because you can't. But there's a whole lot of people in those middle spaces that I think are still rational actors and open to conversation, but the best conversations happen where there's a little bit of familiarity and connection and trust. And that doesn't come from, you know, one lobbying day at the State House. That comes from a longer term commitment to getting to know people and building a relationship. So.
Great answer.
Yeah.
Nice to know you.
Yeah, you too.
You know, I'm gonna ask that the last 2 people in line there ask their questions just back to back, and then you all can answer hopefully in a concise way, and we'll finish up the session. So please.
Hi, Deborah Leff from University of Chicago. I'm a ped surgeon and on the ethics faculty at the McLean Center. So definitions of health and healthcare are evolving, and I'm no longer just a biomedical practitioner, but we need to take into account the social determinants of health and address those within our communities. And to that effect, I think there needs to be some more intentional training of medical students and residents in terms of not only healthcare policy, but ethics as well. In Canada, healthcare policy training is part of the medical school curriculum now. In the United States, there are programs that have elective courses that one can take in healthcare policy. But I think we need it to be more intentionally embedded in our training in the future.
Great, thank you. Last question.
Thank you for your discussion today. So my name is Julie Vaughn. I'm a doctorate in bioethics student at Loyola University. And this panel was really influential for what I'm about to tell you. So I've been working with the King County Public Health for the past year and a half on their racism collaboration. And it is because of my skills that I have in ethics and bioethics. And one of the things that I've noticed working with those people that's in the county is that they don't know a lot about ethics. They may have the title that they're equity and social and all this stuff, but when it comes to answering questions about social determinants of health or about how to dismantle racism, they have not a clue. So they welcome an ethicist at the table, and I'm glad that I've spent a year and a half there, and we have moved the mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, Liz and then Adam, and then we will be wrapping up.
So I'll just, first of all, thank you for having me. This has been a real, I think, break from my norm to be in this room, and it's been a great, great conversation. But I'll just leave you with this, and this again kind of blurs the line between your professional space and your life as a citizen. And at the risk of sounding like the tropey politician, every election matters, and every election is truly the most important of our lifetime because democracy is a gift. And it is not guaranteed. And so your commitment to making the democratic process better in the official side process or whatever you may choose to do in your personal life, don't discount its value. Decisions are made by the people who show up. And that's true at the ballot box, but it's also true in every place government happens. So where and when you can, please do show up and be a part of the conversation.
I feel like you should have actually gone last. Okay, well, I'll just say I really appreciate being here. Thank you so much for these great questions. And I'm happy to sort of continue the conversation related to anything related to both on the research side, but then also experiences engaging with the policy process. And would love to learn from all of you, too. And so in the spirit of collaborative relationships, I hope to create some new ones today. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both, and thanks everybody for the great questions and for staying throughout. So we'll see you the rest of the meeting.